We're going to bring him back as we've been talking with him about the third Monday of every month for the last few months. Dan Wos, author of Good Gun, Bad Guy and Good Gun, Bad Guy 2. Dan, good morning to you. Great to have you back on the program.
Hey, KB, thanks so much for having me on your show. It's always a blast.
Absolutely, and a lot of things to talk about here, especially since the last time we talked, we had the general election earlier in the month. Democrats win the House, and so let me ask you just right off the top of your head, do you see the Second Amendment coming under siege yet again as the Democrats try to step in and maybe change the picture a little bit, and also an interesting Senate race down in Georgia where there was some legislation tossed around by a woman down in that particular state, and she was talking that, she wanted to ban assault rifles is essentially what they wanted to do. But she said, I'm not necessarily about banning things. I'm introducing the legislation so we can have the conversation. But I think you can have a conversation without introducing legislation. I mean, tell me if I'm crazy.
Yeah. You and I are having a conversation, and we're not legislating anything. So, yes, exactly. That's a funny point you made. Well, okay, so where do we start? As far as the assault weapons, first of all, they use that term, or I'm sorry, did you say assault weapon or did you say semi-automatic?
I think I said assault weapon.
Okay. They love to use that term assault weapon. Right. Because what it does is it's basically a nomenclature that was brought into the conversation by Dianne Feinstein and her crew back in the 90s, and it's just a way of scaring people. Half of these people who want to ban these so-called assault weapons, by the way, that's a term that was never really used in the conversation in the public forum until they brought it in. Now they use that term all the time, and it's just designed to scare people. Half of, probably 90% of people who use that term assault weapon don't know what an assault weapon is and can't define it. But so of course they want to bring up the conversation, but they really ultimately want to ban anything that scares them. And black scary guns scare them. So this is all just a big smokescreen to try to implement more gun restrictions.
Well, again, with what we've heard, and some interesting issues have came up here recently, one of which you and I were discussing off the air. This is something that I actually talked about with the listeners last week, and the DOJ rules that bump fire stocks are now machine guns, fall under the NFA regulation, and it seems like what's going on here is certain things that have happened. The National Firearms Act of 1934, that's the NFA, and Gun Control Act of 1968 are being interpreted now by the Department of Justice, issuing a rule that would interpret the definition of a machine gun, right. As we're talking here, according to the NFA of 1934 and the GCA of 1968, to clarify whether certain devices commonly known as bump fire stocks fall within the definition of it says here that's the intro or abstract to the DOJ's newly issued public rule following their re-examination of the classification of bump fire stocks. This, of course, was done after last year's Las Vegas Mandalay Bay shooting, where 58 people were killed and hundreds more injured. That was the only crime in which a bump fire stock had ever been used, and the ATF had issued an approval letter. It says here to Slide Fire for their bump fire stock back in 2010 that read in part, the stock has no automatically functioning mechanical parts or springs and performs no automatic mechanical function when installed. According to what they found here, they said that the bump stock is a firearm part and is not regulated as a firearm under the GCA or the NFA. So now they're going back and looking at this and kind of trying to, I don't know if they're trying to appease people or if essentially they're going back and trying to legislate after the fact. And I guess the question here is, are we going to be seeing more of this in the future where you go back and you try to go over things with a fine-tooth comb, or you try to set up rules and regulations that have been in place for years, and then you turn around and say, well, now that we look at this and now that we reread it and now that we re-examine it, it seems like whatever we're talking about, it could be bump stocks, it could be anything. now we really understand what these certain types of rules and regulations are all about. And so all the things that we put in place prior don't exist any longer. And now we're going to go through and issue new rulings and come out with new ways to try to prevent people from owning certain firearms or certain parts that you can use with a firearm and what have you.
Yeah, well, if they can, first of all, most of the gun owners that I know don't use bump stocks.
Sure.
It's not really an interesting thing. They're not practical. We just don't use them for the most part. So it's kind of ironic that bump stocks were found on the scene at the Las Vegas, killing. And it's kind of ironic how now people are pushing for legislation to ban these bump stocks. And then I think the next step you'll see will be that if bump stocks are banned, restricted, based on the fact that they make a gun act as a machine gun, because now remember that the machine gun or the fully automatic restrictions have already been in place. So now anything that they can qualify under that category is good for the gun grabbers. So what would happen is bump stocks get banned. Well, now anything else that can create rapid fire would also be banned. And my guess is that they would find someone who could shoot a semi-automatic as fast as a fully automatic. And then the idea would be to ultimately categorize semi-automatics under the same category. So this is all just little steps to pave a way for a semi-automatic ban, in my opinion. Now, semi-automatics, you and I both know, make up the vast majority of guns in this country. So I think that's ultimately what they want. And if you followed my train of thought, it's just a path to get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, I'm wondering, like anything else that they do in this country, there are certain times when they put forth certain rules and regulations just to see how people are going to react to them initially, and then they look for a way. It's like when you do something and you're trying to get a reaction out of people so that you can see whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. And so you use this kind of as a litmus test of sorts, and you say, well, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and then you see how people react to it, and you see what kind of observations people make based on the information that they're given about maybe some rule or regulation that they want to put in place, where, certainly people that are law-abiding, gun-owning citizens of this country that are entitled to their Second Amendment right, they hear something, it sets off, an alarm, raises a red flag. They gather all this information, and then they say, well, okay, maybe that wasn't the way to go. But they take all the information that they've gathered, and they go back and they say, well, now let's try to do it this way based on what we know and what people from, law-abiding gun owners are telling us in the United States. And let's see if we can, go another direction or find another route that might be more beneficial to enacting more gun laws on these people.
Well, sure, yeah, and I understand that theory, but the truth of the matter is bump stocks are banned in many states under red flag laws.
Right.
See, red flag laws are these packages of laws that governors putting together, people are putting together for individual states. And in my particular state of New York, the red flag laws are completely overreaching with tons of little restrictions like that. And so the truth is, bump stocks are illegal in some places already, and it's not just a test. It's a reality.
Well, and again, like everything else, you talk about some of the red flag laws, and I know that here, some independent company came in and surveyed the state of Missouri as far as the legislation we have in place regarding firearms, and they said, here in Missouri, it's some of the worst legislation that you'll find anywhere in the country. We have some of the loosest gun laws of any state, and again, really more or less trying to act upon the fear, as opposed to really putting forth anything that that would be considered, honest to goodness fact. It's let's mess with their heads a little bit. Let's get in their heads. Sure. Let's talk about all the let's see how much fear mongering we can do, and then we'll come out swinging after that.
Yeah, well, I call it the anti-gun fear campaign.
Sure.
And it really is what it is, and the interesting thing is just how they're all on board. But let me give you an example. We talked a little bit about the red flag laws. I'll give you an example. I'm sure you heard of the Maryland case. Here's this guy, Gary Willis, who's 60 years old. He gets killed in his own house because a family member turned him in to the cops saying that he could be a potential risk. So now, with the red flag laws that were already in place in Maryland, the police are told to go to the house, get the guns, and then they'll make Gary Willis defend himself and prove his innocence later.
Right.
But in the meantime, they take the guns without due process. So now there was a scuffle, and Gary Willis is dead because of the red flag law. So we have governors. I have a governor, Cuomo, in New York, who's saying that these are common sense. But the truth is, when you take someone's rights away without due process, and you put them, in danger, and you tell the police departments to strong-arm law-abiding citizens, that's not common sense. That's reckless endangerment. And these red flag laws are putting people in danger. The sad part is that we have people, ignorant, anti-gun people, who are supporting this sort of thing. There are actually people online saying that this Maryland situation was a good thing or a success. So these people have been so conditioned and cultivated and brainwashed into believing that the government should take control of your life and tell you what to do. They've been so conditioned to this stuff that they support these laws and they support these politicians who are pushing them. Truth is, it's the most dangerous thing we could ever imagine. It is tyranny, and I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it is, and it's happening now on a state level, and there are knuckleheads out there supporting it. And they don't realize that these type of restrictions, these type of overreaching government actions will affect them in a negative way as well in other areas, in other ways. You give the government that much authority, and we're all in trouble.
9:26 is our time. Our guest is Dan Wos, the author of Good Gun, Bad Guy and Good Gun, Bad Guy 2. We will talk to him on the other side of the break. You are listening to the Morning Magazine on News Talk KRMS, and your phone calls welcome at 573-302-7000. And Dan Wos is our guest, the author of Good Gun, Bad Guy and Good Gun, Bad Guy 2. And Dan, are you working on any more books these days? I know you've been out speaking quite a bit and on the circuit, going out and talking to folks about the Second Amendment, about firearms, about the anti-gunners. Anything else that you've been working on in terms of another book headed our way?
Well, it was supposed to be a surprise, but yes, I am actually working on Good Gun 3, Good Gun, Bad Guy 3, and getting into more of the politics behind the big gun grab. And also working on a lot of things, man. Yeah, and you're right. I have been doing a lot of things. I've been busy. I've been doing a lot of radio, a lot of TV, and there's a lot of local stuff going on right here in New York that I've been asked to get involved with. So yeah, tons of stuff. I can't even really. It's hard to keep up with it all. But working on a new book is one of many things. And what I'm finding, I guess, mostly the most important thing is that there is a hunger out there of people who really do want to support our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our freedoms. And that is the stuff that really empowers me. And when I talk to people, I really I get energized and want to do more and want to do as much as I can. So I'm putting myself out there as much as I possibly can to try to change the hearts and minds of people on the anti-gun side, and try to bring, in my own little way, bring America back to traditional values and support our Second Amendment so people can defend themselves and their families. So yeah, doing a lot of stuff, and I don't see myself stopping anytime soon.
Well, just kind of a history lesson for folks who might be new to the conversation with Dan Wos. You were once an anti-gunner yourself, and after a situation that you were involved in, it opened your eyes a lot as to why there is a legitimate need for law-abiding citizens to have firearms, why the Second Amendment should be and always will be in place so that we can protect ourselves. And I know that there are different interpretations of the Second Amendment depending on who you ask, and people think that it was just put in place for militias years ago, or for this reason or that reason. But it's something that's in the Constitution, has been in the Constitution, hopefully will remain in the Constitution. If it doesn't, I would see the possible uprising of citizens all around this country to make sure it stays in the Constitution. But again, you were somebody who was along the lines of an anti-gunner, and then you had that experience in your life, and it really changed your overall outlook, and that's why we're talking the way we're talking here this morning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was, I guess the thing is sometimes people need a situation in their life that rattles their cage a little bit and helps them see things with logic. And that's what happened to me. I was raised in a pro-gun household. My dad took me target shooting and hunting and things like that. But I went after he died, I went anti-gun. I started hanging with the wrong crowd, as they say. And it wasn't drug dealers, it wasn't bank robbers, it was anti-gun liberals. And when you hang with a certain crowd, you adapt to that environment. And I don't care who you are. We are our environment, and we take on those beliefs and those thoughts.
Sure.
That happened to me, and it wasn't until I had a situation in my own life, and I tell the story in detail in Good Gun, Bad Guy. But it really woke me up. It was a moment in time, one night, that I was unable to defend my wife and protect her, which, by the way, is my job and my responsibility as a man and as a husband. And as a father, it's also my job to protect my son.
Right.
I couldn't do it that night, and it woke me up, and it showed me just how important it is to protect yourself and your family and the good people around you. And I soon realized how important and why that Second Amendment was written. So everything completely changed for me in one moment, one split second. And some people will never get those experiences, so they'll never be able to wake up. Some of the anti-gun people, and I understand that. It's just the way it is. Hopefully, some people can hear my story and look at it with a bit of logic and put politics and aside, and just look at the importance of how valuable it is to be able to protect ourselves with firearms in this country.
Something you and I talked about earlier off the air was the fact that on November 6th, the general election took place, and in the state of Missouri, we had 3 different ballot issues regarding medical marijuana. One of them passed, and now I guess it goes to our legislators to determine whether or not people who are, I guess they are eligible to partake in medical marijuana, they cannot have a firearm. Federal law prohibits medical marijuana users from possessing or buying firearms and ammunition, even if state law allows the drug's use. And so I think a lot of people were excited because, in some instances, there is a need for medical marijuana. We were the 32nd state to approve medical marijuana, and it gets into this whole argument with, okay, fine, you're saying that people who use medical marijuana cannot own a firearm or ammunition. You can't buy it. But it's saying, well, then what about people who are on prescription drugs? What about people who drink? I mean, it's okay to have a beer and own a firearm, or have plenty of beer and a firearm, or whiskey or wine or whatever it is you're partaking in. And in I don't know how it's set up in New York where you're at, but I would imagine since it's now medical marijuana is now acceptable in 32 states. This argument is going to be being heard more and more in state legislatures than ever before.
Well, yeah, you made a good point. Well, let's compare that, because let's compare it to the bump stocks, because this sounds like another them creating another precedence. You compared medical marijuana to pharmaceutical drugs,
mm-hmm.
which you're under pharmaceutical drugs, you are able to own a firearm. But now, bringing in the medical marijuana, which, by the way, I'm not a big fan of. I don't smoke it myself, but some people do, and that's great. Do whatever the heck you want. The pharmaceutical or the medical marijuana sounds to me like it's another precedence being created before our very eyes. So if medical marijuana will now be a precedence where you can't own a firearm, well, how is that any different from other drugs you might be prescribed by your doctor? So in other words, another pathway to more gun restrictions by creating a precedence, just like what I fear is happening with bump stocks.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you look at it from the standpoint of, okay, so now everybody was on the bandwagon. We wanted to get the medical marijuana issue taken care of here in the state of Missouri because we feel as though people, there are certain people with certain types of illnesses, diseases, whatever it is that they're suffering from, PTSD and the like, that could benefit from medical marijuana. Well, okay, fine. Now, do we then say, you can't buy or possess a firearm or ammunition? I mean, it's not just the firearm; it's the ammunition that goes along with it as well. And so now they're at a crossroads. Do I want to, be able to defend my family? Do I want to maybe be able to go out and hunt? And because it's not saying people that buy a firearm to protect themselves, or do they buy a firearm to go hunting, or do they buy a firearm to go skeet shooting? It's no, you cannot buy a firearm or buy the ammunition if you partake in medical marijuana. This is according to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It says here that means Missouri residents won't legally be able to have a license for medical marijuana and possess a firearm at the same time. So, are you giving up one for the other? But why should you have to give up one for the other? What difference does it make?
You shouldn't have to. It almost sounds like they're implying that medical marijuana will somehow, debilitate you or make you irrational. And I don't know. I don't know how that could ever make sense. I mean that because if you're going to, this is just my opinion. I haven't really put a lot of thought into this, but if you're going to legalize medical marijuana, why would you do it if the fear was you're going to have to take away these people's guns because they're going to act irrational?
Mm-hmm.
So the point I'm trying to make, I think, is either it's okay or it's not. But you don't give something like that, make something legal, and on the backside make part of the law that you lose your rights in other areas. So I totally agree with you. I think it's wrong. But the point I'm trying to make is does medical marijuana make you irrational? Mm-hmm. Yes or no?
Right. Well, in the thought process being, again, do I give up one for the other? How do I look at this? And essentially, some other things that have been put out there since the legalization of medical marijuana and the legalization in some states of recreational marijuana is the fact that now we're seeing more accidents. And, again, we can go down the same road as people who are on prescription drugs that abuse them, or people that get drunk and get behind the wheel of a vehicle, and
Sure.
and so now you want to use you want to discount marijuana for people who may need it, or people who may enjoy it, by saying, well, now we're seeing this big increase in the number of car accidents, and people that smoke marijuana are out there running into other people, and there are a variety of reasons why people get into automobile accidents. Drugs and alcohol being a part of that. Age could be a part of that. Being a driver, a new driver that's just not hasn't matured enough behind the wheel to be able
Sure.
to go out there. And so, you can look at you can take any particular subject again and skew the results so it's in your favor of whatever it is you're trying to push.
Yeah, absolutely. And to talk about the trade-off, I don't think anybody, I agree with you, I don't think anybody should have to make that type of trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
If medical marijuana does help them, well, I mean, they should be able to do that. If they're going to categorize it as a pharmaceutical, drug,
right,
then how is it any different than, I don't know, you name the drug. How is it any different than anything? And should people have to choose? Absolutely not. That's crazy. That's more government control over the people. And the ironic thing is that the people who support these politicians and these policies, they have no idea what's happening to them right now, what's happening, and how they're going to feel the effects of all this stuff later, when they themselves, the ones who voted for these anti-gun politicians, how they're going to feel the effects later on in life when other rights are taken away from them. And it's happening right now as we speak. We're watching it happen, and we're watching these people, these anti-gun, left-wing voters cheering them on. And that, to me, is scary. That's like watching, a bunch of puppets follow along and do what they're told. And it's scary because some people, the logical thinking people, the people who can see into the future and watch and look at this stuff and imagine, hypothesize the effects of these things, we're looking at them going, are you insane for voting for this? Are you for accepting this? And so the way they set these things up is very dangerous. And I just hope that people can come to their senses and stop supporting this kind of stuff.
9:45, we need to take a break. Let's take a quick phone call first. Caller, go ahead. You're on KRMS. Good morning.
Yeah, KB. Good morning, guys. Here's the irony of the whole thing. I'm a Vietnam veteran retiree, okay? The government put us on LSD trips back in the late 60s, early 70s for experimental reasons.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these soldiers nowadays are coming back without limbs. They get into a process where marijuana helps them. What right has the government or anybody have to tell them they can no longer own a gun because they are defending their country? They lose a limb. They're in pain. I'm up there in age now. I'm 65, and I got things that are bothering me. I don't smoke or anything, but if I ever get to the point where it really starts to ail me, and a little bit of Mary Jane will make me feel a little better. The country never cared about how I felt in Vietnam as a 17-year-old kid, all right? So let them come and tell me that they got to take my gun because I'm trying to take something to ease my pain, and they might as well have a box ready for me because the government trained me to be a killer. They trained me to survive in the bush, and they gave me drugs while I was there, and that was okay. But now all of a sudden all these bureaucrats are going to say, well, we want to limit people with weapons, so these guys that take marijuana and nothing but a bunch of hippies, they better look at the other side. A lot of these guys are good Americans, good soldiers, duty, honor, and country too, not like a politician. I promise you the moon and give you crap. Have a good one, KB. That just annoys the heck out of me.
Thanks for the phone call. And with that, Dan, we're going to jump into a quick break. We'll come back and talk about the callers' thoughts on the other side of the break. You're listening to The Morning Magazine. My guest is Dan Wos, the author of Good Gun, Bad Guy, Good Gun, Bad Guy 2, and soon to have the third in the series, Good Gun, Bad Guy 3. It's The Morning Magazine on KRMS. Low tomorrow night of 32. 56 on Wednesday, 58 on Thanksgiving Day. So we've got a lot to look forward to. And hopefully you will get out and be able to enjoy your Thanksgiving. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes left with our guest Dan Wos on The Morning Magazine. And interesting points of view brought up by our caller there as far as being in the military and what they did and what they expected. And now that these folks who served our country are back home, and, medical marijuana may be something that they seek. As a matter of fact, Dan, I talked to a gentleman here, it's been several months ago, who sat in the studio with me and had been in the military, in the Army, I believe, and had suffered some issues and was going through some serious bouts of PTSD, or a serious bout of PTSD. And medical marijuana was obviously something that this person saw as a way to relieve some of the things that they had been dealing with. And so, again, we mentioned the trade-off. But let's, honestly, let's focus a little bit on these men and women who have served in our military and are coming home and now being expected to do things the government's way, in a way that I think most law-abiding citizens wouldn't agree with in the first place.
Yeah, well, that last call was really powerful, and it's great to hear from people who are actually there. And to him, I say thanks for the call and thanks for his devotion to our country.
Absolutely.
Willing to put his life on the line for rights of everyone. So thanks to that last caller. And it is a very frustrating process that we seem to be going through with all this stuff. And particularly, I focus particularly on gun rights, Second Amendment things. And it's very frustrating, no matter what we're talking about politically. But guess whose job it is to fix it? We have to fight for what's right, and we have to keep arguing and debating and having our voices heard, like you and I, KB, are doing. More people need to step up and speak their mind and call their senators and do whatever we can do, because sitting back and watching it all happen is dangerous for future generations. And I don't want my son or his kids to have to deal with overreaching laws put in place during a time when I had something that I could when I could have done something about it.
Right. We've got another caller on the line, Dan. Let's go back to the phones. Caller, thanks for holding. You're on KRMS. Good morning.
Good morning, KB. Hey, so here's my thought on this whole deal. They're going to sit here and tell me just because I'm going to, be prescribed this certain deal, I can't own a firearm. Well, how's that working out for them when they tell a felon he can't own one? That's all I had. Thank you.
Another good point. Another good point. And see, it doesn't make any difference what we're talking about. If we're talking about drugs, if we're talking about alcohol, if we're talking about felons, because we know that a lot of the crime that's committed in this country by people who use a firearm, they've obtained that firearm through illegal means. And, What does that mean to the law-abiding citizens? Absolutely, caller. Great call.
Yeah, the laws that are created for gun restrictions are created for the people who we don't have to be concerned with. They're the only people who follow the laws. The good law-abiding people are not the ones going out hurting others.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're focused in the wrong area. But the thing is, they focus on this thing that they call gun violence. And it's all based around guns. And I even get caught up in the conversation myself. We talk about this gun violence. And there's no such thing as gun violence. There's human violence. And I try to make the point that what we're all focused on are gun restrictions and gun laws and statistics and all this gun stuff, when really we should be focused on human violence and what causes it. But what happens is, if we were to focus on human violence, we would be shining a light on failed Democrat policies. We'd have to talk about gang violence and poverty and sanctuary cities and open borders and and all sorts of stuff that they create. And those are the things, and those are some of the reasons why we have such violence in this country. So they take that focus off of their failed policies, and they tell you that it's all because of guns.
And another interesting aspect, and you talked a little bit about it when you mentioned, open borders and things like that. We're dealing with this issue now along the U.S.-Mexican border where these folks are coming up from Central America and wanting to seek asylum in the United States and all of the issues that are being caused here. But, let's talk about illegal immigrants in this country obtaining firearms and then using them for criminal purposes. And again, there's another road that we could go down. We probably don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But again, you talk about the law-abiding citizens in this country that understand what the Constitution is about, what the Second Amendment is about, what, abiding by the law and owning a firearm and owning a firearm legally, owning a firearm responsibly, getting the education, learning to, handle it properly and everything that surrounds it. And now we've got another issue with people that are coming into this country illegally, obtaining firearms. And again, much like criminals that already exist in these United States, it compounds another problem when it comes to firearms.
Well, let me ask you a question, KB. As the Democrats are encouraging these illegal trespassers to come over into our country, let's imagine that you lived on the American side of the border, and let's say you lived right on the border. Would you want to have a gun or not have a gun?
Well, considering what happens a lot of times when people come into this country illegally, I would definitely want to have a firearm to protect myself, my family, my property. Absolutely.
I think most people would agree with you, and I think it's ironic that the same people who are trying to flood as many illegal Democrat voters into our country are the same people that are trying to strip you, the good, law-abiding American citizen, of his rights.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. No doubt about it at all. And again, that's more of what we're seeing as these folks show up. And the interesting thing that's going on now with a lot of these folks is here they are at the U.S.-Mexican border, and the people in Mexico don't want them there. They wish they're telling them to turn around and go home because they're
being violent. They're creating all sorts of havoc.
Exactly.
In Mexico.
Exactly. And we've heard of, there was an instance where I guess some of the Mexican officials were fired on because there were people that were in the process of making Molotov cocktails to throw at the U.S. troops and the Border Patrol agents along the U.S.-Mexican border. And some Mexican officials came across these people, and they were shot at. And they somehow, some of these, I don't know if they brought it with them or if they obtained it somewhere between leaving Central America and making their way through Mexico. They obtained a 9mm and were shooting at these officials in Mexico. So I think maybe now the Mexican authorities see the magnitude of this situation as it's continuing to develop. But aside from all of that, we've got about a minute or so left here. Let's. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of summarize or mention anything that you feel is important as far as people that are listening to the program this morning.
Well, I would just urge, especially right now, California residents. I have friends down in San Diego, and I would just encourage them to fight for their gun rights because as these illegal trespassers are coming into our country, they're crazy for supporting anything that disarms them. So please get on board. And if people want to learn more about how the mindset works, how the anti-gun mindset works, they can get my book or both my books at goodgunbadguy.net or goodgunbadguy.com. And I try to lay all this stuff out for people so they understand, so we can make good, rational, logical decisions and choices.
And we'll be awaiting the arrival of Good Gun Bad Guy 3. Dan Wos, as always, sir, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and we'll catch up with you again in the month of December. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, KB.
Absolutely. Hey, folks, stick around. We've got CBS Local News, Hour 2 of the Morning Mag.
If you want more interviews by me, click one of the videos on the right. And remember, your Second Amendment, it's not a privilege, it's your right.